Hello everyone and welcome to Literature Snacks, the set of videos where I make an analysis of a literature masterpiece in roughly 15-20 minutes. Now it's April. April is Shakespeare month, so I decided to dedicate this episode to Shakespeare, and I'm going to analyze one of his most famous tragedies, Macbeth. Now, since it is absolutely impossible to fit everything that I should be saying about Shakespeare in 20 minutes, I decided to divide the episodes in 2 episodes. So this is episode 1, and in 2 weeks you will see episode 2. In episode 1, I am going to make the synopsis of the plot from the beginning up to Act 3, Scene 4. And I'm going to analyze 2 themes, which is masculinity and violence and nature and kingship. In the next episode that you are going to see in 2 weeks, I'm going to finish the synopsis of the plot and I'm going to analyze 2 more themes. Are you ready? So, shall we go? Macbeth is one of the late tragedies of Shakespeare, and it was written in 1606. It is arguably the most intense for action and human relationships. It is inspired to real historical figures who lived in Scotland at the beginning of the 12th century, where Scotland and England were still fighting with the continuing pressure of the Danes at the borders. So the Scotland that we are talking about, it looks pretty much like England in the Last Kingdom, the TV series inspired by the books of Bernard Cornwell. One of the greatest appeals of the play is the power that it has on the audience. We ask ourselves continuously if the witches are real, if the prophecy is real, if the ghosts are real, and the theater leaves us with doubts, as in the theaters things are real and not real at the same time. So let's go to the first part of the synopsis, from Act 1, Scene 1 to Act 3, Scene 4. The play opens up on the 3 witches casting spells and then moves to the battle camp, where King Duncan, King of Scotland, is told how Macbeth and Banquo have successfully defeated the Danes. One of the enemy armies was led by the rebel MacDowell, Thane, which means Lord of Calder. While Macbeth and Banquo are heading back to the camp, they encounter the 3 witches who prophesy that Macbeth will be made first Thane of Calder and then King of Scotland. They also prophesy that Banquo's descendant will reign Scotland. The witches vanish, and the 2 men are rather skeptical about the prophecy until they arrive at the camp and they find out that since MacDowell has been sentenced to death for treason, Macbeth is now Thane of Calder. Now, Macbeth at this point is intrigued by the prophecy, but he cannot picture in his mind the idea of the death of the king. Although he is disturbed by the fact that Duncan has declared that his son, Malcolm, will be his heir at the throne. Duncan decides to dine at Inverness, Macbeth's castle, and Macbeth writes to his wife about the prophecy and about the king's visit. And we get to know Lady Macbeth. Lady Macbeth desires kingship for her and her husband so bad that when Macbeth arrives at Inverness, she persuades him to kill the king and to frame the guards, who they planned to make drunk during the banquet so they won't remember a thing. That night, Macbeth stabs the king in his sleeve, and when he gets back to Lady Macbeth, he forgot to leave the daggers on the guards to frame them. But he is too afraid to go back to the king's chamber, so Lady Macbeth herself, she takes the bloody daggers from her husband and go and place them on the sleeping guards. At this point, a knock is on the door. It's Macduff, another Thane of Scotland. Now Macbeth receives him and takes him to the king's chamber, where they discover the murder. Macduff gives the news of the king's death to the two princes, Malcolm and Donalbain. Macduff is telling them that the two guards are suspected, but Macbeth enters and says that he has killed the guards out of fury for their crime. Fearing for their life, Malcolm and Donalbain flee to England. Now, another Thane, Ross, enters and says that unnatural things are happening outside. For example, the horses are eating each other. Because of their escape, the two king's sons are now suspected of the murder of King Duncan. In the same time, Macbeth is declared king, and Macduff goes back to his castle. Because of the prophecy, Banquo suspects Macbeth, but Lady Macbeth invites him to a solemn supper, which is a banquet, probably to keep him and his son Fleance under control. So they accept the invitation and go for a ride in the afternoon. But Macbeth now is so tormented by the prophecy that he sends two murderers after Banquo, and he doesn't say that to his wife. The murderers succeed in killing Banquo, but Fleance manages to escape. That night, at the royal banquet, Macbeth sees Banquo's ghost and has a reaction that startles everyone at the banquet, who are mainly people from the Scottish nobility. Now, Lady Macbeth tries to ease the situation, but at the moment everyone is suspicious of the new king. Growing more and more frightened, Macbeth decides to visit the witches to be reassured. And this is the end of Act 3, Scene 4. Violence is the common thread of the whole tragedy. As it starts in battle, it continues with murders and ends with a suicide and an execution. What is absolutely clear about the message is not exactly the origin of violence, which I'll be going to back later, but the consequence of violence. By using violence to take the throne, Macbeth has opened the way for others to take the throne in the same way. He also is forced to commit more and more violence in order to maintain his throne. The message is clear. Violence will only lead to more violence in a terrible, never-ending spiral that can only become continuously bigger. As Macbeth acknowledged to himself when he sees Banquo's ghost at the banquet, he says, "Blood will to blood." The link between the masculinity and violence is brought up first by Lady Macbeth. Firstly, when she reads the letter from her husband, knowing that he will never have the courage to kill the king, she wishes literally to be unsexed, as if the only thing that is stopping her from committing a regicide is the fact of being a woman. To prompt her husband to commit the murder, Lady Macbeth questions his manhood. Same technique that Macbeth uses on the two murderers that he sends after Banquo. Every time that manhood and masculinity is discussed, foul act of violence follows. Even if it may look like violence can only come from men, what is more striking of the play is that clearly violence and evil can also generate from women, such as Lady Macbeth, for example, or even the three witches, who are actually the symbol of evil. Indeed, aggression is more striking when it comes from women. Because if men are normally connected to violence, women's aggression goes also against all the expectation that society have from them. Lady Macbeth is the clear representation that women can be as cruel and ambitious as men. And this has led experts to point out the tragedy of Macbeth as the most misogynist of Shakespeare's plays. But in a world where we are trying to raise awareness about toxic masculinity and normalizing women with ambitions, Macbeth can be taken as a good example to take down gender roles, as the play clearly shows that there is no such things, but otherwise insisting on gender roles as Lady Macbeth does with her husband can only lead to psychological annihilation. When the play was written in 1606, the belief that the health of the reign was depending on the goodness of the king was still persisting. Its medieval value that still persisted in the 17th century. The idea that a good king led to good harvest and good weather. So, it should surprise us that since the murder of King Duncan, who is presented as a good and just sovereign, the weather keeps turning bleak with thunderstorms. And Ross that speaks about unnatural phenomena such as the horses eating each other. The murder of the king has led to a breach into the balance of nature. Malcolm and Duncan, who are good sovereign, use a metaphor of nature, such as Duncan to his son in Act 1, Scene 4. Duncan says, "I have begun to plant thee, and will labor to make thee growing." While Lady Macbeth and Macbeth flee from nature in every discussion that they make, suggesting that they, as being regicide, are natural. And we can see two examples of this in Act 1, Scene 4. First, when Macbeth says, "Stars, hide your fire, let not see my black undead desires." And when Lady Macbeth tells to her husband in Act 1, Scene 5, "Look like the innocent flower, but be the serpent under it." There is a larger context about the theme of kingship, as the play was written between 1605 and 1606. At the time, King James VI of Scotland, named now King James I of England, was king. King James had given his patronage to Shakespeare's company immediately. So the fact that the play is about past the King of Scotland was definitely a show of gratitude to the new king. But the action of giving patronage was also a tactic to ensure good propaganda. Nothing new. It was also Elizabeth I's technique, so it's okay. Shakespeare was in need to find a theme that would celebrate the righteousness of King James I, especially since just the year before, in 1605, there had been the famous Guy Fawkes attempt on the 5th December, where a group of Catholics tried to kill the king and the whole parliament. That's why the act of murdering the king has such a devastating effect. Another tribute to King James lies in Banquo's character. Although Shakespeare changed a lot of things, the tragedy of Macbeth is inspired to real Scottish events. The first source that Shakespeare used was the Holinshed Chronicles, published in 1577. Real Banquo had conspired with Macbeth and had indeed helped to kill the king, who was a completely different sovereign than the Duncan that we see in the play as a just and good sovereign. Since King James was Banquo's descendant, Shakespeare modified the plot, having Banquo on the right side of the tragedy, and Banquo's descendants are mentioned in the prophecy as the future King of Scotland. Once again, it is possible to find a very important modern theme in such a so much time-honored play. Lady Macbeth has been demonized for so long and has been used as a symbol of how indeed women are cunning and dangerous. And it has also been used as a reason to justify why women should be ostracized from power. Looking from a different perspective, Lady Macbeth is clearly the symbol of the complete impropriety of the existence of gender role. Lady Macbeth lacks any sign of feminine empathy. She speaks of murdering children, and apparently the only thing that stops her from murdering the king is the fact that King Duncan looks too much like her father. She also mentions the fact that she is a woman, but she prays for being unsexed in order to perpetrate the murder. There is a clear message that people should not be defined only by their gender. Men can be afraid, such as Macbeth, who doesn't want to kill the king, and women can be cruel, such as Lady Macbeth, who desires so much to be the Queen of Scotland that prompts her husband to commit regicide. We are putting so much effort nowadays to try to normalize this concept, when Shakespeare probably already got it 400 years ago, along with the concept that violence is never a solution and it will lead only to more and more violence. So again, thank you very much for watching this video. I hope that you like it, and I hope that I kindled in you the interest in reading Macbeth. Obviously in 2 weeks you are going to see the next episode, so if you don't want to miss how the things are going to turn out, well, it's a late Shakespeare's tragedy, so you probably know exactly what is going to happen. Everybody dies. If you like it, please, I would kindly ask you to press like and leave a comment. This will prevent the algorithm of YouTube to drown out all my work. Videos need to create interaction in order to be suggested to other viewers. Remember that this is a language school. We teach English, French, Spanish, Italian for foreigners, and German. We teach teenagers as well as adults. We deliver courses in presence and online. This is our Facebook page. This is our Instagram page, this is our email address, and in the description you can also find the school website. Thank you very much for watching this video. I hope to see you soon with another Literature Snacks. Bye bye!